Rubenstein. Well, his team is number one in America, but Dan Rubenstein's always number one in our hearts. Also the number one download for us on the weekends on a Saturday night.
Wow.
Check out the Solid Verbal. Dan, it's good to have you back. You've been on this podcast in a few different iterations. You are, and you were, the first podcast I ever listened to. Your show,
Wow.
the Solid Verbal. Yep, I remember that being like, this is cool. I've known Dan for a long time. I remember kicking it with the Piesman, one of your old crafts back in the day in New York City. We go way, way back. Thank you for taking some time in an extremely busy schedule to hang out with us today, man.
Oh, my pleasure. Look, when you're both 28 years old, like you and I both are, we both started in this business when we were 10. I remember watching Yogi run around Elite 11 fields. This is not a new thing for Yogi. He's kind of the godfather of behind-the-scenes quarterback stuff. And were you broadcasting for like Fox College Sports?
Sure. Yeah.
Oh
yeah, it was Steve Fiziak,
legend,
and Sam Ponder, formerly Samantha Steele,
Yes.
and I. We were a crew back in 2009 doing a bunch of what was then, I think, only a 8 or 10 team Big 12 league. Pretty much most of those games, and Pac-10 games. I remember calling Jim Harbaugh, Stanford against Steve Sarkisian, Washington.
A lot of Nick Holt action in Yogi Roth's life.
Yeah. Love Nick Holt. Nick Holt, by the way, you'll love Nick Holt for many reasons. One being he's currently coaching in Italy, and we will get to it later. But if you don't know Dan Rubenstein's other passion, it is food. And not only am I finding out you're giving like Guy Haberman food recommendations,
of course,
on our road trips, which I love, but you also thrive at making pizza. You showcase that sometimes in your social media. So everybody go check out Dan Rubenstein on the social for not only college football, but also inspo on the pizza tip, man. Yeah, we'll get to that at the end. I want to play a little fun game before we get you out of here around pizza and college football. But let's just start where your heart is, right? I left my heart in Oregon, right? Like, here we go. The Ducks, number one. I know you guys talked about it over the weekend on your show, but here's what it's like to be you right now. You have tracked this program since you went to college there. You're very close to it. Now they sit number one in a poll that doesn't really matter, but still, it's the only one that really gets talked about right now. How do you feel about the Oregon Ducks?
Never been better. And I don't know if that's even fully true, but I like saying it. It sounds good. It's a unique situation, right? Oregon has had incredible runs, incredible coaches, incredible offenses, incredible defensive players. You look at some of the big names up front in like the early 2010s with DeForest Buckner and Eric Armstead and the Marcus Mariota offenses, and even like Darren Thomas, Jeremiah Masoli. There's a lot of great players who have played. The product has never felt more complete than how it feels right now. When you look at a disruptive defensive line, when you look at a ball hawking secondary, when you look at having kind of an average performance and winning it 35-0 on the road in a letdown spot, that's kind of new as an Oregon human. And seeing an accurate quarterback, not terribly new because of what Bo Nix was able to do. That was, I think, statistically the best Oregon offense ever last year under Bo Nix and Will Stein. But that after a couple of rocky weeks early, that Dylan Gabriel is bombing it down the field against everybody, that Jordan James has been good, that there are a lot of teams who start out the season and they have kind of an uneven or a suspect offensive line, right? And that's tough to figure out mid-year. Oregon got a little healthier. They shifted around a couple of guys, and there hasn't been a single conversation about the offensive line since that Boise State game. That's new. So when I say it's never been better, I've never had fewer questions about an Oregon team. The great ones, the good ones, the whatever ones. Like, yes, it was great watching Vernon Adams bomb it down the field in 2015. Wasn't a great defense. And so that knowing that Oregon can play a B- game and comfortably beat a decent team, that's new.
I love that. Okay, so I believe that Oregon is the most improved team that I've seen this season.
Okay.
Called their opener against Idaho. You referenced the Boise State game against a team that's going to be in the conversation for a CFP berth. We know that. And, of course, a Heisman candidate in Boise State's running back, Ashton Ginty. But where do you net out on that? Because when I watch them, I think every week I'm like, growth. To your point this past weekend, no number one team this season has done what they did in terms of once you're ranked. I get the schedules are different, but they looked the part, right? They didn't play down. They didn't have a letdown. It was a short week. And I just thought it was dominant, defensive front. We'll get into all the elements of it, but do you agree with that overall sentiment?
Yeah, there's a an element to college football teams and great college football teams that you take care of business. And we say, like, win your clunkers on the solid verbal. And I think that's super important.
I like
Everybody's
that.
going to have a very down week. It's better to win 35-33 than to lose 35-33. But there is something about Oregon over the course of this season that they're incrementally taking care of business more often, whether it was a game against UCLA, whether it was being somewhat close against Oregon State, then running away with that 49-14. You want to feel good when you're watching a top 5 team, top 10 team, that they can take care of business. You watch a team like Iowa State, who's in the top 10 right now. They're not taking care of business. They're winning games. And, the sort of phrase winning is a skill came from what Kalen DeBoer was able to do at Washington last season. And they're finding ways to pull out games late. But what Oregon's been able to do in terms of getting off the field on third down on defense, that they're just stacking little things. And that's how you improve over the course of a season, that you're not dropping dumb balls as an offense. You're not whiffing on protection calls as an experienced quarterback anymore, that you are deciding on third down that this is fourth down territory. So we're going to have a 2-play package in, and it's the right thing to do. And so, yes, Oregon is stacking little things in a way that they weren't doing in those first couple games, which is a little bit excusable. It's a new quarterback. It's a new offensive line. The tackles were back, but shuffling around things, they figured it out. And that is with how many new players everybody seems to have, including Oregon. Like, you can look at Oregon starters on both sides of the ball. And I did this, and it's dotted with South Carolina and Washington and Duke and Rhode Island. There's just a lot new that wasn't there a couple of years ago. Oregon is stacking little things, and I think that's why they've improved like they have.
Yeah, I think that's well said. The number that jumped out to me in advance of the season was that I counted 10 second-year players at the edge on the defensive front. We've talked about this offline before.
Yeah.
And coming off this weekend, we give out awards every week. Like, you guys do an element of that too on your show. Mm-hmm. We gave out that dude award. The guy just showed up, and it was Mateo Uyunglele on the defensive front. It was like 3 weeks ago, we all talked about Jordan Burch as being the guy that everybody thought he would be coming out of high school, or when he arrived in Eugene in his second school, to your point of transferring from South Carolina. But that group hasn't missed a beat since his injury, whether it's Tatum Tuioti, Mateo, who we referenced. I just think that's what I trust the most. And I think if you can do that, you can find consistent performance. So my question for you is, like, among the teams right now, whether you want to look at the AP top 10 or the solid verbal top 10 or your top 10 or top 5, and you can kind of project the playoff. Mm-hmm. And you look at, you need to have consistent performance against really good teams for at least 3 weeks, maybe 4. It feels like this team is the one I trust the most. Where do you net out as we enter week 9 around the team you trust the most that's in contention to find a spot in this new 12-team playoff?
I think it's Oregon. I think it's Oregon in this moment. There are a couple of things I don't fully trust quite yet, and I don't think Dylan Gabriel can change the fact that he's 5'10". I don't think. We'll see what happens technologically in November, but that's something that you see some of the defensive linemen. You saw what Georgia was able to do in mixing up the way that they attacked Quinn Ewers in the Texas offensive line, that I'm not fully there that Dylan Gabriel is a finished product at, again, 5'10", that with long arms and big bodies and simulated pressures, that he's a finished product in that regard. But when you look at the flaws of a team like Ohio State, which I think defensively, they didn't touch Oregon. And so that, to me, even with a schedule that's pretty good, Penn State is a we'll see right now in that top 4 or 5 range. I know they're number 3, I think, right now. But Oregon seems to be in a place that they can survive losing their best defensive lineman in Jordan Burch. You mentioned how Mateo Uyunglele stepped up and the edge guys stepped up, and the defensive line is deep and they're rotating in young guys in an impressive way. That I don't know that Oregon has separated themselves, even though they're number 1, but everybody's flawed. Oregon has enough right now that for the first time in my career as an Oregon fan, that I feel pretty decently about how they stack up against a Georgia team who has struggled at times finding go-to guys on offense, without Ladd McConkey, without Brock Bowers from California, by the way. That there is something nice about Oregon having potentially the fewest questions. And so I would still put Georgia there. I would still put Texas there. I give Sark a lot of credit and a lot of benefit of the doubt in terms of figuring out how they can improve, because that's something we talked about on the show, that Georgia almost had that opportunity given their game against Kentucky, given their game against Alabama. to self-scout in a way that Texas couldn't, given their schedule, with a down Michigan and then Colorado State, UTSA, and just not Mississippi State, a number of teams that are just not meeting that bar. That Georgia had that opportunity to say, okay, here's how we can improve, and these are things we can change, whereas Texas didn't. They will now, especially given the rest of their schedule. But yeah, in terms of those teams in that top 5, I still think it's Ohio State. I still think it's Texas. I still think it's Georgia. And Miami's that wild card to me. They're winning a bunch of weird, close games, but Cam Ward is looking sharp. Their offense looks sharp. I just don't think they have the defense and the discipline on defense to beat anyone in the country right now.
One of the things that has, I think, continually stood out to us here at Y Option is in realignment, the scheduling variance is so drastic, and not like 8 versus 9 conference games. Like, that's ridiculous. And hopefully that gets annulled at some point and just have some sort of equity in that regard across the sport. Right. But in terms of your point, like, you look at like SC and UCLA schedule, gnarly. Indiana, I'm going there this weekend. I'm so stoked on Coach Signetti and Tino Sinceri and Mike Shanahan, like the Pittsburgh contingency, man. Hail to Pitt all day long on this show.
Yeah.
But it's just been a different run. Same thing for Texas and Georgia. Like, how do you net out trying to make sense of college football in a world where there's better games every week, and you could argue with realignment, but everybody isn't playing in the same cadence of schedule in terms of teams missed big type of games. I mean, I think Michigan has only had 2 away games, I think, all season long.
Sounds right. Yep.
You know, like it's just kind of crazy in that regard, sitting here at the end of October. But I'm curious how you net out of evaluating teams, knowing that the scheduling has less equality than it's probably ever had.
Yeah, and it's impossible to gauge in the offseason too, because you couldn't say that like, hey, good for Oregon, they miss Indiana, right? That like You could say Oregon's schedule seemed pretty tough in the back half. Look at, maybe an improved Wisconsin and having Michigan and having Jed Fish in Washington. Well, having Michigan, it doesn't seem so bad right now. We don't really fully know what Wisconsin is, but yeah, good for
Illinois
a lot of these teams.
Good.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But good for a lot of these teams missing Indiana, right? That like you can become fortunate in an unexpected way, and your schedule can become unfortunate in a number of ways. And you mentioned USC, and man, if USC can't beat Rutgers this week, that's a different conversation to have. But yes, you're a West Coast team, and you sign up to play in the Big Ten, and you sign up knowing that Maryland and Rutgers and Penn State and all these teams are in the conference. You're signing up for, even if your schedule looks okay, you're looking at a lot of weird flights. You're looking at a lot of bouncing back and forth. You look at Stanford in the ACC, bouncing back and forth between Syracuse and coming home and then bopping over to Clemson and figuring out if the Clemson equipment manager can do your laundry. I don't know if you saw that story. Pretty incredible. Stanford and Clemson had a conversation about they didn't know if they could bring all of the equipment back in a truck and have it drive back to Clemson. And the equipment managers had a conversation about laundry, and if Clemson could cover Stanford's laundry. So
did they cover it?
No, they turned out Stanford could do their own laundry. Okay. They figured it out. But Clemson, to their credit, was like, yeah, we got you, dude. We're totally good. Cool. Tell us what you need.
That's good. Locking arms with your new conference friend. So let me follow up on that.
Yeah, please.
Because I always felt like, I work for the Big Ten Network now, as you know. So I'm calling these games. I was just at Rutgers. SC, to your point, just lost at Maryland. I always felt like those games, let's just take the Trojans, going to Maryland, you can comp it to going to Cal, right? Or going to Minnesota, to me, was comped to going to Oregon State. But to your point, much longer of a flight and no history of opponent. Like, you kind of just circled at least the Minnesota one, which we called of like, that's got upset written all over it. Mm-hmm. If you want to call it that at the time. Now, obviously, it wouldn't be if you looked at the records of these two teams.
Yeah.
But I wonder where you net out on USC. You're from LA. I live in LA. What is it? 14 points separate them from being undefeated. Like, it's a handful of plays in the tightest of margins. LA, as you know, and this SC community is going crazy. All the alums are tweeting up a storm, blah, blah, blah. We've seen this happen before. Where do you net out, living in the middle of the country, having West Coast roots, and covering the nation on the Trojans?
I think it's a pretty significant disappointment, and it's something that I think, looking at USC the past couple years, I always felt Lincoln Riley could find a quarterback. I always felt Lincoln Riley could find, a safety here and there, a corner here and there, obviously very active in the portal. I thought the group of receivers heading into this season, Deuce Robinson, Jacoby Lane, Zachariah Branch, like different sizes, different abilities, different strengths, like I thought that was going to be one of the better units in the Big Ten, no matter the team. But you look at how Lincoln Riley's recruited. It kind of doesn't matter the speed you recruit if you don't have an offensive line and you don't have a defensive line in terms of recruiting out of high school. I think you can fill in playmakers on defense. I don't think there's any substitute for not building an offensive line internally. And it's a very specific recruiting strategy. But when you look at the teams, either on the West Coast or anybody who's improved or anybody who has a big brand name like USC does, it doesn't matter how you recruit if you're not recruiting lines. And we saw Michigan take advantage of USC up front a ton. We saw Penn State take advantage over the course of a game. If you don't have 9 or 10 quality defensive linemen to get after the quarterback, if you don't have a solid offensive line with maybe a swing guy to come in there when you're feeling a little bit thin, Miller Moss has been running for his life. And I understand that there aren't linemen on the West Coast in the way that there were when Pete Carroll was coaching in the 2000s. But I don't know, from day one, you look at how Dan Lanning has recruited, and it's not fully fair to compare USC to Oregon, even though they're on the same coast. There are a lot of teams that are not necessarily close to where linemen are growing up, but that he was unable to build from the inside out from day one. And I know there's stories coming about not being at Mater Dei or Bosco in Southern California. I don't know. I think he's let down that school in terms of that specific area, because you look at the end of the Michigan game, you look at the end of the Maryland game. I don't know. You got to rotate in big bodies, and those guys are tired at the end of those games. And I hope it's fixable for USC, because I think USC would be a net positive if they're a quality team in this conference. But until they're able to start stacking lineman classes, I don't see it improving a ton.
Okay, so let's have this conversation, because I think this is really cool. Because I think there's one hand where you can be a distinguished alum and light up SC. You could be a fan, and of course, like my text threads, you can imagine what they are with SC alums.
Mm-hmm.
There's the other hand of like, let's have a contextual conversation. So let's just go year one context. Comes in, takes over a team that we all would agree was down. Yeah. Right? Check. Okay. They get the greatest player, at least quarterback I've ever seen in Caleb Williams. They have an offensive line that came out of high school that was really connected and proved to be extremely positive. Mm-hmm. Right? And they have a schedule that helps them out, and they win a bunch of close games.
Yeah.
Right. They have the schedule that doesn't have Oregon, doesn't have Washington, and they're on the doorstep of a CFP and a Pac-12 championship game. With a healthy Caleb, they probably win that game against Utah from being there. Right. Cool. That's year one. Cool. And now the bar is high. The Trojans are back. I think, to your point, there's a world where it's like, okay, do we know our reality in the building of, hey, we got a little bit lucky here. We overachieved. Let's go build the foundation here. Or do you say, hey, we got the best player in the world. Let's go get the best available players to replace this offensive line. That's what they did. It didn't work.
Right.
And now I look at this team and the offensive line that you referenced and the guys that struggle up front. I think they brought in 6 linemen that are now in their second year in the program. Some are starting as redshirt freshmen. Some are backups as redshirt freshmen. But there is like a young nucleus there. They signed a bunch again last year on the offensive defensive fronts. Like the foundation, I think, is young, but I think it's pretty strong. Fans could care less about that now, but I wonder if a year from now, with Elijah Page and company, some of these like then third-year players look like some of those linemen on those teams that you referenced. Like, do you feel even better? Or are you like, no, man, like this isn't working? Because that's what I'm hearing out here. And I'm like, whoa, we all need to pump the brakes and have a little bit of a contextual conversation around it. I'm kind of curious where you net out, because it's easy to comp it and be like, what's Dan Lanning doing? Heck, what year one is Kurt Signetti doing? Like, there's a lot of those conversations that I think are happening that I do not believe are comparable.
Well, I think it's a vision thing too, that I think a lot of SC people, SC fans feel like, okay, we don't have a strong offensive line. How do we game plan around it? And that it seems to be this defiance about maybe not running the ball as much when Quentin Joyner and Woody Marks actually look like promising running backs and big play guys for USC, and maybe not leaning on them a little bit more if Miller Moss is going to have no time. That they're looking at game plans, they're looking at the ends of games, whether it's a time thing against Penn State and not utilizing timeouts, whether it's the end of the Maryland game, that they see a pattern that USC is losing winnable games. And I can talk about the offensive and defensive lines. You can too. But it's never been easier to build out, I think, a better defensive line with talent. And I think there is this fallacy, and you mentioned, right, bringing in the good offensive lineman. You have Caleb Williams, but there's this idea of almost team washing that, like, oh, we brought in a guy from Texas A&M, we got in a guy from Florida or whatever. And you're like, they didn't play there, and so they're just a guy who didn't play at these
Right.
big places, and we just assume it's going to work out. Whereas, and I'm just talking about high school, that USC has to have an internal conversation with itself. And this is a different era, right? This is an NIL era. This is, are we in? Do we want to spend like Georgia and Oregon and Ohio State and Alabama and everybody we measure ourselves against, or not? Because if they're not meeting that bar financially, you're going to see more recruiting classes that get torn apart by Oregon and Georgia and whoever. And I understand it's way more expensive to be in LA and to pay coaches to be in LA and to build out giant recruiting staffs in LA. Like, there's a lot that goes into it behind the scenes that makes it more difficult to win at a place like USC. But it's a conversation of, like, are we in or are we out? And when I think USC had, like, I'm going to get this number wrong, but it's in the vicinity. Lincoln Riley signed one blue chip defensive player in his first two classes or something, and Dan Lanning signed 13, right? That when you look at numbers like that, it's not a college football universe in which you can say, this guy's gonna be really good in 3 or 4 years. Just you wait. Because all of these schools are signing Michael Williams and Mateo Uiagalelei, these guys that are contributing positively right away. And USC is like, just wait till Alani Noah is a junior, a redshirt junior or something like that. And you're like, I don't know if that's the universe we live in anymore.
Yeah, it's such a thoughtful conversation to have. Like, I always go back to, like, if year one, if you told me that my blue blood program of choice, whether it be Oregon, SC, Pitt, whatever, they came off a down year, made a coaching change, and you said, hey, the first 2 years are going to be tough, but
Right.
years 3 through 7 are going to be awesome. If we go on, he's going to stay for 7 years as our head coach. I would take that.
Yeah.
But if, to your point of, like, it's a different era, there's also the era of, like, no, new energy in the program, go get best available. Like, that to me is going to be such a fun dance to watch. I almost think now, if I'm an AD, if I was an athletic director of a school and I had to make a new hire to be a head coach, okay, you've got your A-listers. Let's just say you miss on your first target. My next target, I would literally go down the Kurt Signetti train of, like, who's thriving at a lower tier school that will bring their top 12 players, that will bring 19 players from that league. Like, it's just going to be, it's a really cool dynamic to have that type of dialogue, as we're seeing our first coach just got fired in college football. We're seeing coordinators either get fired or resign. Like, that philosophical choice, I think, is going to be, is more thoughtful than ever before versus give me best available. It's like, what's coming with best available? And then they don't always come. Right? Like, they all didn't go to UW. And I think we all thought they would have. So it's interesting. All right. I want to get you out of here quickly, because I know you got a lot going on. I want to talk about Colorado, because I think we all love, and we're here for the tea on Colorado, but now we're here for, like, quality play from Colorado in a big way. Heisman. Where do you sit on that? Like, I don't even like talking about it till November. We're on the verge of it. Where do you net out in that regard on those two topics?
Has Diego Pavia not already locked it up at Vanderbilt? Is that not a thing yet? Okay.
He would win an award at, like, wherever your old job.
Yeah.
The Heisman.
Okay. So I've seen a lot of really good players this year. There is one player who, to me, in this moment, is the most cartoonishly excellent, and that's Ashton Genty. Now, it's still early. He has the biggest game of his conference slate. Obviously, had a couple of enormous runs against Oregon, but that's late night against UNLV on the road. And I wish it were not kicking off at whatever it is, 10:30 Eastern time. He's been the most cartoonishly excellent player this year in terms of both production and how he's looked doing it. So I think that's where I land right now. I mean, you look at the young receivers, you look at Dylan Gabriel, there's a lot to love about this year. But I think, to me, in terms of pure excellence, because we know it's kind of a running back quarterback award right now, that's where I land in this moment.
Yes or no question. Do you think that the Heisman Award should be pushed a month and be given after the season because of the amount of games that are in this new playoff era?
Ooh, good question. But if Ashton Genty doesn't end up in the playoff because whoever else does ends up as the G5 representative, the unofficial, G5 representative, I don't know how you hold that against his excellence. So
Right.
I don't know. I guess he's a rare case because generally this is given to, an SEC player or a Big Ten player or some kind of power conference player. No, I would do regular season. I would keep it that way just because I think there, as you mentioned before, there's so many variables, right? That a team doesn't end up in the playoff, but they're an 11-2 team, or it's hard to sort of measure the magnitude of excellence. So I'm okay with it. I think I already think the season's going to feel too long. So I like kind of the tentpole stuff in December. I'm good with that tradition. As for Colorado, they can get after the passer. Speaking of teams who have improved up front, Sam Okunlola and BJ Green. I think BJ Green has something like 12 Havoc plays on the season already. The corners are playing well. Even the non-Travis Hunter corners are playing well. Their defense is ahead of their offense, and it's very quiet because they're in a new old conference in the Big 12, and there's no clear measuring stick in that conference in this moment. But I don't know, forget the offense for a second. I think the defensive playmakers there in a flawed conference and on a flawed schedule. And offensively, we're seeing them run a little bit more. I still don't love their line. Shador makes absolutely incredible plays. And some of the teams they've played against this year are just flawed. And they got out of that Baylor game in very fortunate fashion. They destroyed a flawed Arizona team. I don't know. It's a good year to be a quality team in that conference.
Yeah. Can we
which I think they are.
An Oregon, Colorado playoff game.
Oregon, Colorado playoff game. Oregon will rip their arms off limb from limb.
I love it. Okay, I want to play a little game with you because as we started off the top, you are a pizza connoisseur. You've taught me and many others the art of that craft, as well as you educate many of us in college football with your incredible podcast called The Solid Verbal. Go check that out at a variety of different places, including their Patreon. It's amazing. Okay, if these schools were pizzas, what pizza would they be? Okay, we got 5 schools, we got 5 pizzas, and I know you can go everywhere from a topping standpoint. Okay, so we are going number 1. Let's go to the Oregon Ducks.
Okay. Oregon is a supreme pizza this year. They're not extra beefy. It's not deep dish or anything like that. They're not built in the way that old Wisconsin was. But there's a lot of different flavor to this team. So we'll call it like a pepperoni and onion and garlic, maybe some spicy honey, maybe some pineapple there for Dylan Gabriel. They are filled with toppings. They are a more is more pizza this year.
I love it. Okay, let's stay in LA, your backyard.
Yes.
The Trojans coming off a challenging game at Maryland. What kind of pizza are they?
Oh, man. So the Trojans are Chicago Tavern Cut. So it's extra thin. Like the cracker crunch. There's a lot of crunch to them with that speed, but the depth isn't there. The beef isn't there. So they're just like the extra thin, crispy, still fun, still a great snack, but it's not super filling right now.
Coming off their first win in the Big Ten era, Deshaun Foster's UCLA Bruins.
Okay, so they're bagel bites. UCLA, it's a nice story. I just want more, right? They're leaving me wanting more. That Ethan Garbers had a great all-purpose performance on the ground, through the air. You called that game. I have great memories of bagel bites, but it's not something I want for dinner right now. So hopefully UCLA can graduate from bagel bite into a bagel pizza, because we all had after school snacks, those bagel pizzas, but the dough isn't fully formed yet for UCLA, so we're relying on something out of the freezer.
Okay, well, I'm heading out to Indiana for Chris Ignetti's squad. They're facing Washington, and this is college football through the lens of the West Coast. So help out our fans in Bloomington. What is UW in your oven?
Oh, Washington. Okay, something new, inconsistent. I'm gonna go with maybe like a Neapolitan pizza.
Okay.
So it's smaller, right? So the line isn't what it was last year. That was sort of the hidden secret of Washington last year. Such a strong offensive line. I don't know if they won the Joe Moore Award or they were up for the Joe Moore Award. Yeah. So a little bit softer up front, but I like where Jonah Coleman is as a running back this year. So I'm going to say it's more of a knife and fork Washington team than a big substantial one in your hand like Neapolitan pizza can be. So I don't know. It's a classic Washington team. It's not the best Washington team. It's not the worst Washington team in the way that Neapolitan is classic. Washington, I'm not a Neapolitan guy myself. I'm more of a New York pizza guy, but it's respectable.
All right, all right, and then finally, a team that played UW earlier in the season. I believe they're going to San Diego State this coming weekend,
Okay.
and they got a shot in our eyes here if they win out with their only loss to Boise State, who may win their league championship and get a bid, as you referenced, into the CFP as a conference champion. Washington State, your final pizza of the day on the menu.
Ooh, Washington State. So, okay, we're talking about a good running team. Not a lot of opposition thus far this year, but a nice win against Washington. This one's tougher to me. So I'm saying quality pizza, but not necessarily top of the top. I'm going to go with a Long Island grandma slice, okay? It's not your thickest, right? It might not be the one that you choose when you see all the slices in front of you. But every time you get it, you're like, oh, I like this square. There's a little bit of crispiness to it. It feels substantial in the hand. It's not that big New York slice. It's not the Detroit slice. It's not the it's always quality. It's always a nice option. And it's a good story that grandmothers on Long Island created this because they didn't have the hot pizza ovens. So it's sort of something out of nothing. Does that make sense for Washington State? Like, nobody thought that they could perform. The grandmothers on Long Island were like, how are we going to make pizza? And here's Washington State just chugging along, collecting W's.
Collecting W's. Tell you what, you are a great storyteller.
I didn't know we were going to do that. That was pretty good.
That was right off the cuff. I think you should add that to the late night on Saturdays when you guys are a little delirious.
I still need to make you pizza.
Show.
I still need to make it. You got to come through.
I hope hopefully to be back in Chicago in November. Yeah. If so, I'll come in a day early. We'll come hang out. We'll go to Evanston.
Yes.
We'll walk around campus. Mm-hmm. We'll be warm. We'll have a cup of Joe. We'll make a pizza. We'll talk football.
Yeah.
And I know we'll get you back on this show.
Anytime.
Dan, you're one of my great friends. You've been great counsel for me on many fronts. Of course, around college football, but also life, man. Thank you for the time. Tell that beautiful family of yours hello and enjoy what will be an incredible week 9.
Oh, you too. Thanks as always.